Welcome home. It's the Godward Podcast, and you're a listener. I'm your host, Casey. We're going to talk about the Iliad today. I think I decided to do the Iliad when I heard Anderson Cooper say this the other day on CNN.
It's that he's the most powerful person in the world, and we see him like an obese turtle on his back, flailing in the hot sun, realizing his time is over.
What a nice simile, technically. I was going to say analogy. Simile, I guess. Simile is really the focus of this episode because the simile is kind of I'm going to try to do an analogy here. Let's see, how's it go? It's bourbon is the whiskey that's from Kentucky. Is that right? I think that's right. So a simile is the bourbon. Wait, a simile is to bourbon, I guess, as analogy or metaphor is to whiskey, something like that. That's what we're thinking about today, anyway, is thinking through analogies. And I've got my Iliad open here. I basically just want to read you a bunch of these. I also have a Twitter account, one of my many Twitter accounts that I hope you'll follow and boost. I don't know why this one never got popular. It's the handle is Onto Metaphorist, so O-N-T-O, metaphor, I-S-T. And I scrolled all the way back to the beginning of it. It says, the first tweet there says, "New account will be like an overpriced bag of roasted kale dashed with sea salt that you see out of the corner of your eye in a Starbucks." Isn't that nice? Or, "Being 39 is like when you have a t-shirt broken in and it's perfect and you can tell that it has another couple hundred wears left in it." Or, "Politicians are bacterial infections and the news is a handrail in a crowded subway car and you're like somebody carrying baby wipes." But actually, most of these on this account are not as obvious as that. Part of what this account turned into is playing around with what analogy even is. And what's interesting to me is, like, if we say something like if we say like politicians are bacterial infections, that one's pretty obvious. Like, everybody's going to get the analogy, right? But there are certain ways that you can make analogy that, like, you've made it work in your head, but it might not be clear to an outsider. And so in general, we don't use those analogies because we know that they will just confuse people. If you say something like, caffeine is like a mechanical advantage. Now, at first, you're going to be like, what? And if you're smart, you might be able to piece it together, right? You might be like, okay, caffeine is like, okay, mechanical advantage. I'm thinking of like a lever, a fulcrum, which you put on a thing so that you can lift something heavier than usual, or a pulley. Okay, caffeine allows you to do things you might not normally be able to do. But if we move on and read the next oldest tweet in that sequence, mushrooms are coincidences. Boy, now I'm telling you, it's hard for me to even recall how I made that an analogy, right? Or schizophrenia is like an ability. You see, and that one's topical because that's part of what I think is going on with analogies, is that basically, in some sense, the schizophrenic is someone who sees analogies where others don't. And like that part of their brain has gotten too loose, maybe. Something like that. How about this one? Trees are like axons or dendrites. Prayer is like gardening. Wood is like the past. Honey is sunshine. Purple is like brown. That's amazing, isn't it? Man, so those are fun. You should follow the Onto Metaphorist account. I've got some background music I wanted to try for this episode. I'm playing around with background music here. I think this is just a Bach sonata, like slowed way down, and I thought it would make for nice mood music. I hope it's not too loud. Let's turn it down just a touch. Just like that. Sounds good. So the Iliad, as you know, is the story of, the Achaeans and the Trojans battling out over Helen, who got kidnapped, and then the death of Patroclus, who was like Achilles' BFF, or, the moderns all say like his gay boyfriend or something. In any case, it's basically a big battle, and I reread it like last year in the Richmond Lattimore translation, which I strongly recommend. And Lattimore is an excellent poet, basically. He picks up on the analogies, I think, better than any other poet I've ever read, and he knows what to make of them. So in some of these cases, it's usually, the descriptions are usually of some military maneuver. The troops did this, and it was like, the following. Or it's so-and-so made a move, like he stabbed or threw a spear or ducked or whatever, and that was like, the following. And so I'm not going to probably always describe exactly what's going on, because I have marked in a certain color of my highlighter all the good metaphors in the Iliad. So I'm just going to read through them almost randomly, adding commentary where I can, but mostly it's just to go, isn't that nice? So the first one is in Book 2 that I've got highlighted here. Like the multitudinous nations of swarming insects who drive hither and thither about the stalls of the sheepfold in the season of spring, when the milk splashes in the milk pails, in such numbers the flowing-haired Achaeans stood up through the plain against the Trojans, hearts burning to break them. Most of these analogies are, of course, structured like that, where it says, like something, so also something else. Or, as this, so that. And so that's the typical structure of the analogy here. For instance, as a man who has come on a snake in the mountain valley suddenly steps back and shivers come over his body, and he draws back and away, cheeks seized with a green pallor, so, in terror of Atreus' son, godlike Alexandros lost himself again in the host of the haughty Trojans. Isn't that fun? Let's see. This will be a bit of a different tempoed episode, won't it? We're really getting to know each other here on the Godword podcast. Like old friends reincarnated in another lifetime. Of Pallas Athena. She made weariless fire blaze from his shield and helmet, like that star of the waning summer, who beyond all stars rises bathed in the ocean stream to glitter in brilliance. All right. How about this one of what is this? Of Tydeus' son or something. He went storming up the plain like a winter-swollen river in spate that scatters the dikes in its running current, one that the strong compacted dikes can contain no longer, nor do the mounded banks of the blossoming vineyards hold it rising suddenly as Zeus's rain makes heavy the water, and many lovely works of the young men crumble beneath it. Like these, the massed battalions of the Trojans were scattered by Tydeus' son, and many, as they were, could not stand against him. What an image, right? And that's the idea here. And I think part of what's going on is that in the Iliad, there is this, it is like a broken flood. Like all of a sudden the dam breaks and humans, Homer, begins to think in image rather than in, prosaic terminology, right? We're no longer thinking like in abstract concepts. We're thinking in specific images here. We're going to compare things that happened to elements of nature. And by doing so, you're going to see this story so much better. The strong rage tripled took hold of him as of a lion whom the shepherd among his fleecy locks in the wild lands grazed as he leapt the fence of the fold, but has not killed him, but only stirred up the lion's strength, and can no more fight him off, but hides in the steading. And the frightening sheep are forsaken, and these are piled pell-mell on each other in heaps, while the lion, raging, still leaps out again over the fence of the deep yard. Such was the rage of strong Diomedes. Skipping a little. Next he killed 2 children of Dardanian Priam. As among cattle, a lion leaps on the neck of an ox or heifer that grazes among the wooded places and breaks it, so the son of Tydeus hurled both from their horses hatefully, in spite of their struggles, then stripped their armor, and gave the horses to his company to drive to their vessels. Amazing. But Aeneas sprang to the ground with shield and with long spear, for fear that somehow the Achaeans might haul off the body, and, like a lion, in the pride of his strength, stood over him, holding before him the perfect circle of his shield and the spear, and raging to cut down any man who might come to face him, crying a terrible cry. And yeah, sometimes it's as easy as just saying, like a lion, but sometimes these analogies become incredibly, layered. And so you're going to see, not just like a lion, but a specific kind of lion at a certain time of year, under certain conditions, and so on. Let's see, the Achaeans, wait a minute. And these pulled themselves about and stood to face the Achaeans, while the Argives held in their close order and would not be broken, as when along the hallowed threshing floors the wind scatters chaff among men winnowing, and fair-haired Demeter in the leaning wind discriminates the chaff and the true grain, and the piling chaff whitens beneath it. So now the Achaeans turned white underneath the dust. The feet of the horses drove far into the brazen sky across their faces as they rapidly closed and the charioteers wheeled back again. What an amazing way to think, isn't it? Now the 2 Aeantes and Odysseus and Diomedes stirred the Danaans to fight these, since themselves they did not fear the force of the men of Troy, nor their charges onward, but stayed where they were, like clouds, which the son of Cronos stops in the windless weather on the heights of the towering mountains, motionless when the strength of the north wind sleeps, and the other tearing winds, those winds that when they blow into tempests, high screaming, descend upon the darkening clouds and scatter them, so the Danaans stood steady against the Trojans, nor gave way. One of you is bound to just love this the way I do. I mean, it's like, I watched this whole video of Douglas Hofstadter, who is kind of famous for thinking about these things, although in my view, he's little more than a typical linguist. I don't know why he's so famous for this, but he has this one talk, if you want to Google it on YouTube. It's called something like Analogy as the Basis of All Thought or something. And in his view is not any different than like Ralph Waldo Emerson's, who said, in some sense, all language is an analogy. And I think that's in his essay Nature, where he says, for instance, the word spirit is derived etymologically from spiritus, which means wind. And so it's like, when we say spirit, we are actually already always thinking in analogy. Spirit is like the wind, right? So, yeah, kind of, but that's not as interesting to me as thinking specifically about language which turns to the figurative or the analogical or the metaphoric to better express what couldn't be as well expressed by, prose language. And ultimately, of course, my interest in this is because we're trying to approach, the higher ideas, right? Like the big ontological, metaphysical questions, the things that Parmenides was interested in. And if you really want to do that, you almost always will have to turn to analogies, metaphors. Just think of Book 7 of the Republic, right? We are like people in a cave. And so then you're going to get a 4-page analogy. Orsilochus and Crethon. These, as 2 young lions in the high places of the mountains, had been raised by their mother in the dark of the deep forest. Lions which, as they prey upon the cattle and the fat sheep, so these 2 guys had been raised as lions by their mother in the deep dark forest. Lions which, as they prey upon the cattle and the fat sheep, lay waste the steadings where there are men, until they also fall, and are killed under the cutting bronze in the men's hands. Such were these 2, who, beaten under the hands of Aeneas, crashed now to the ground as if they were 2 tall pine trees. Wow, it's like metaphor upon metaphor, isn't it? Amazing. As when out of the thunderhead the air shows darkening after a day's heat, when the stormy wind uprises, thus to Tydeus' son Diomedes Ares the brazen showed as he went up with the clouds into the wide heaven. As when the juice of the fig in milk white rapidly fixes that which was fluid before and curdles quickly for one who stirs it, in such speed as this he healed violent Ares. Isn't that amazing? That's just, rather than just saying like he healed Ares quickly, right? You're going to compare it to the juice of a fig. It's amazing. I just wish people would appreciate this with me. Book 7. And as 2 men of the sea in their Actually, let me stop. Let me read the beginning of this again, because I'm going to start a sentence earlier, because this is the first stanza of Book 7. And so it's fun to just include the whole thing. But you'll hear the analogy begin when I say, as 2 men of the sea. So speaking, Hector the glorious swept on through the gates, and with him went Alexandros his brother, both of them minded in their hearts to do battle and take their part in the fighting. And as 2 men of the sea, in their supplication the god sends a fair wind, when they are breaking their strength at the smoothed oar sweeps, driving over the sea, and their arms are weak with weariness, so these 2 appeared to the Trojans, who had longed for them. Amazing. You know, one of the other great analogies to sort of take root firmly, it may be even more ancient than the Iliad, but one of them is the analogy of the heart, which we so take for granted, don't we? I mean, everybody understands what the heart means analogically, in metaphor. The heart, the heart. He was a person of heart. Just as we understand the guts also. That's another one that's sort of used here in the Iliad sometimes. But it is a metaphor, right? I mean, the heart itself is just that sort of pumping muscle, but we understand what it means to say, like, to memorize something by heart, or, to have a sunken heart, or to, whatever, so on. So with hearts made high, these sat night long by the outworks of battle, and their watchfires blazed numerous about them. As when in the sky the stars about the moon's shining are seen in all their glory, when the air has fallen to stillness, and all the high places of the hills are clear, and the shoulders out jutting, and the deep ravines, as endless bright air spills from the heavens, and all the stars are seen, to make glad the heart of the shepherd. Such in their number blazed the watchfires the Trojans were burning, between the waters of Xanthos and the ships before Ilion. Oh my God, like that seriously makes my brain just sizzle. So good. Book 9. So the Trojans held their night watches. Meanwhile, immortal Panic, companion of cold terror, gripped the Achaeans, as all their best were stricken with grief that passes endurance. As two winds rise to shake the sea where the fish swam, Boreas and Zephyros, north wind and west, that blow from Thraceward, suddenly descending, and the darkened water is gathered to crests, and far across the salt water scatters the seaweed, so the heart in the breast of each Achaean was troubled. Oh, you guys, like, is that making it go or what? I mean, man. Because, like, think of it, right? This is like on the eve of the big battle. They're sitting there around the campfires, all these guys. They want to fight. They're ready to win. You know what I mean? They're thinking of Helen. They're thinking of valor and honor and all that stuff. And so you want to depict for readers, like, the mood in the camp. And so you go like, oh, the guys were really excited to fight the next day. No, that is not poetry, right? That is not what a bard does for us. He says, as two winds rise to shake the sea where the fish swarm, Boreas and Zephyros, north wind and west, that blow from Thraceward, suddenly descending, and the darkened water is gathered to crests, and far across the salt water scatters the seaweed, so the heart in the breast of each Achaean was troubled. And that is like gold to me. Like that's because, Thrace was up north of Greece, this inland. It's basically like up into Europe, right? And so you've got the west wind, which is Zephyros, and the boreal wind, which comes from the far north, blowing down like hard into Greece and stirring up the scary cold waters. And such were the hearts of the men on the eve of the battle of Troy. Jeez, that's amazing. That is amazing. I don't think this is an analogy, but it's a good one. Oh yeah, it is actually. It is an analogy. Here, Book 10, still on the eve of the battle. Now beside their ships, the other great men of the Achaeans slept night long, with the soft bondage of slumber upon them. But the son of Atreus, Agamemnon, shepherd of the people, was held by no sweet sleep as he pondered deeply within him. As when the Lord of Hera, the lovely-haired, flashes his lightning as he brings on a great rainstorm, or a hail incessant, or a blizzard. At such time, when the snowfall scatters on plowlands, or drives on somewhere on earth the huge edge of tearing battle, such was Agamemnon, with the beating turmoil in his bosom from the deep heart, and all his wits were shaken within him. Jeez, the power of that language is just amazing, isn't it? Man. All right, here's one of... they're sort of coming within a spear's throw of each other now. And it says, as when two rip-fanged hounds have sighted a wild beast, a young deer, or a hare, and go after it, eagerly always through the spaces of the woods, and the chase runs crying before them, so the son of Tydeus and Odysseus, sacker of cities, kept always hard on his heels and cut him off from his people. Yes! Yes! Just as when two rip-fanged hounds chase down a wild beast. Isn't that amazing? Ready for another? And this one's amazing. And again, it's not just like a lion, right? Like that would be one thing, but this is not that. This is the kind of analogizing that has been perfected over like an eon, basically. Achilles brought these two ships in from Ida, and then it says, and as a lion seizes the innocent young of the running deer, and easily crunches and breaks them, caught in the strong teeth, when he has invaded their lair, and rips out the soft heart from them. And even if the doe be very near, still she has no strength to help, for the ghastly shivers of fear are upon her also, and suddenly she dashes away through the glades and the timber, sweating in her speed away from the pounce of the strong beast. So there was no one of the Trojans who could save these two from death, but they themselves were running in fear from the Argives. Oof. It's just so good. They killed with the bronze, and among them powerful Agamemnon went onward, always slaying and urged on the rest of the Argives. As when obliterating fire comes down on the timbered forest, and the roll of the wind carries it everywhere, and bushes leaning under the force of the fire's rush tumble uprooted, so before Atreus' son Agamemnon went down the high heads of the running Trojans, and in many places the strong-necked horses rattled their empty chariots along the causeways of battle, and longed for their haughty charioteers who were lying along the ground, to delight no longer their wives, but the vultures. It's just the best. It's just the best. I mean, people think you have to read for like the plot, because every modern pop best-selling book on the New York Times bestseller list is about the plot. But literature can be about thought itself, right? It can be about just the language starts to just be the thing that you're chewing on. It's like, oh, just give me another, just hit me with another analogy, Homer. And he goes, okay. While he was pondering these things in his heart and his spirit, the ranks of the armored Trojans came on against him, and penned him in their midst, but made thereby a wound in their ranks, as when, closing about a wild boar, the The hounds and the lusty young men rush him, and he comes out of his lair in the deep of a thicket, grinding to an edge the white fangs in the crook of the jawbones, and these sweep in all about him, and the vaunt of his teeth uprises as they await him, terrible though he is, without wavering. So, closing on Odysseus, beloved of Zeus, the Trojans rushed him. Jeez. How is this podcast free, you know? How is it free? We're into like book 12, and it says, Hector, as he had before, fought on like a whirlwind. As when among a pack of hounds and huntsmen assembled a wild boar or lion turns at bay in the strength of his fury, and the men, closing themselves into a wall about him, stand up to face him, and cast at him with the volleying spears thrown from their hands. And in spite of this, the proud heart feels not terror, nor turns to run. And it is his own courage that kills him. And again he turns on them, trying to break the massed men. And wherever he charges, the masses of men break away in front of him. Such was Hector, as he went through the battle and rallied his companions and drove them on to cross over the ditch. I mean, that is so good. Isn't this background music kind of helpful and nice? I don't have to be talking every second. I'm getting down. I can't believe the time is going by so fast. Here's one. Book 14. The wall of the Achaeans overthrown. As when the open sea is deeply stirred to the groundswell, but stays in one place, and waits the rapid onset of tearing gusts, nor rolls its surf onward in either direction, until from Zeus the wind is driven down to decide it. So the aged man pondered, his mind caught between two courses, whether to go among the throng of fast-mounted Danaans or in search of Atreus' son Agamemnon. It would be so much easier to just say he was confused, wouldn't it? And so much less awesome and effective and really borderline sacred, this writing. He spoke, and the goddess of the white arms, Hera, did not disobey him, but went back to tall Olympus from the mountains of Ida. As the thought flashes in the mind of a man who, traversing much territory, thinks of things in the mind's awareness. I wish I were this place or this, and imagines many things. So, rapidly in her eagerness, winged Hera, a goddess. Jeez, that's awesome. All right, now I'm going to read you back-to-back similes. And these describe the scene as, who is it? I think it's, it's Hector giving a speech. And he wraps up his speech, Apollo. Apollo speaks back to Hector and says, take heart or whatever. And then it says, he spoke and breathed huge strength into the shepherd of the people, into Hector. As when some stalled horse, who has been corn-fed at the manger, breaking free of his rope, gallops over the plain in thunder to his accustomed bathing place in a sweet running river, and in the pride of his strength holds high his head, and the mane floats over his shoulders. Sure of his glorious strength, the quick knees carry him to the loved places and the pasture of horses. So Hector, moving rapidly his feet and his knees, went onward, stirring the horsemen, when he heard the god's voice speak. And as when men who live in the wilds and their dogs have driven into flight a horned stag or a wild goat, inaccessible on the rocky cliff or the shadowed forest has covered the quarry so that men know it was not their fortune to take him, and now by their clamoring shows in the way a great bearded lion, and bends them to sudden flight for all their eagerness. So the Danaans, until that time, kept always in close chase assembled, stabbing at them with swords and leaf-headed spears. But when they saw Hector once more ranging the men's ranks, they were frightened, and by their feet collapsed all their bravery. And as when, in the dim of the black night, two wild beasts stampede a herd of cattle or a big flock of sheep, falling suddenly upon them, when no herdsman is by, the Achaeans fled so in their weakness and terror, since Apollo drove terror upon them, and gave the glory to the Trojans and Hector. And the Trojans, hearing the thunderstroke of Zeus of the Aegis, remembered even more their warcraft, and sprang on the Argives. They, as when the big waves on the sea, wide wandering, wash across the walls of a ship underneath the leaning force of the wind, which particularly piles up the big waves, so the Trojans, with huge clamor, went over the rampart, and drove their horses to fight alongside the grounded vessels with leaf-headed spears. But as a chalk line straightens the cutting of a ship's timber in the hands of an expert carpenter, who by Athena's inspiration is well versed in all his craft's subtlety, so the battles fought by both sides were pulled fast and even. Want to hear 3 in a row? Sometimes he does 3 in a row. I guess these will be the last 3 I read. I'm only in book 15 here, but these will be the last 3 similes that I read, and then I'll just try to think about it for a second. In this scene, the Trojans, in the likeness of ravening lions, swept on against the ships. Pallas Athena was strengthening Achilles, but even so, he could not break them for all his fury, for they closed into a wall and held him, like some towering huge sea cliff that lies close along the gray salt water and stands up against the screaming winds and their sudden directions and against the waves that grow to bigness and burst upon it. So the Danaans stood steady against the Trojans, nor gave way. But he, lit about with flame on all sides, charged on their numbers and descended upon them, as descends on a fast ship the battering waves storm-bred from beneath the clouds, and the ship goes utterly hidden under the foam, and the dangerous blast of the hurricane thunders against the sail. And the hearts of the seamen are shaken with fear, and they are carried only a little way out of death's reach. So the heart in the breast of each Achaean was troubled. Hector came on against them as a murderous lion on cattle, who in the low-lying meadow of a great marsh pasture by hundreds, and among them a herdsman who does not quite know how to fight a wild beast off from killing a horn-curved ox, and keeps pace with the first and the last of the cattle always, but the lion, making his spring at the middle, eats an ox as the rest stampede. So now the Achaeans fled in unearthly terror before Father Zeus and Hector. Oof! Man, if one of you could write like that, civilization might be saved. We can, of course, look at the analogies and parables used in the New Testament. They're among the best. Jesus talking about the wedding feast, or the parable of the sower, or the old wineskins and new wineskins, and so on. And we can discuss sort of how he uses them to describe an otherwise ineffable thing. I mean, why is it that every time even his disciples come to him and say, "What is this kingdom of heaven you keep talking about?" He, every single time, answers them in analogy and never in prose. Why is that? It seems the answer must be that what kingdom he is imagining is an indescribable kingdom, in common, ordinary, prosaic terms at least. And so he has to turn to analogy. One of the things I worry about with analogical thinking like this, or with metaphorical thinking, is that so many of the classics rely on nature imagery, like, the image of, in the Iliad, the lion pouncing on a herd of sheep or whatever. And this is the kind of image that would have been, I guess, pretty well known to people 2,500 years ago, but it's less well known now, And so, the same goes for something like Jesus and the parable involving a mustard seed. I remember a few years ago I read finally, at age 37 or something, that the mustard seed is, I think, the smallest of all seeds, or among the smallest of all seeds. And so it sort of learning that about the mustard seed, deepens the meaning of the analogy, right? If you don't know that, you don't really understand what Jesus is saying there. But of course, that knowledge may not be common knowledge anymore, and so on. The same goes. I remember being a child and thinking, you would sometimes hear people say things about separating the wheat from the chaff or whatever, and it would be like, which one of those is good again? How am I supposed to know these things? I don't work on a threshing floor, and so some of these analogies are sort of becoming obscure to us. But on the other hand, I don't think, I remember one time reading in where did I read this? Some author, I think it might have been even Ayn Rand saying something smart for once, where she said, if you're ever writing a novel, you should never make reference to anything that didn't exist 100 years ago. Because if you do that, it'll become effectively like a dead metaphor in the future, right? So don't talk about television. You don't say the mind is like a computer, because that's not going to hold up. I mean, there will be, some better analogy for the mind in another couple hundred years, and you'll be a forgettable writer. So I think we have to stick to nature as the basis for our analogies. I guess that's part of what's going on here. But of course, it takes knowing nature to really know and appreciate these analogies. The older I get, the more I love them. Thanks for listening to this special episode on the Iliad. I will, of course, come back to the Iliad and do probably more on it, on the plot, on the idea of the hero and the archetypes and all that stuff. But for now, that was enjoyable for me, at least. I'm not going to tell you what we'll talk about next time, because I haven't even thought of it yet. But it'll be good, I assure you. Come back. Bye-bye. Driftwood is like poetry. An idea is a knife. Saturn is like loss. Rain is confetti. Time is a vine. The pyramids are like hypotheses.